This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, but also maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Shulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
And we are back. We could dedicate the entire episode to the new Department of War, but we will not, because we love you, our listeners, and that would probably actually just put us all at the bottom of the bottom of the deep dark hole that we find ourselves in. So instead, we will cover lots of fun topics today, starting off with something that's not around the Department of War, nor deep and dark. I saw this actually on our separate podcast online recently, and it had a fabulous question that I loved of what was a favorite clothing item that you had as a child that maybe you wore maybe a little too much. And I will start with me because I had a hot pink and white tie-dye t-shirt that had a palm tree at the front that I think I wore, if not every day, then multiple days of third grade. I vividly remember getting it from Target, which Target at the time was a new hotness in our town. It was so exciting to have a Target. It had clothing section.
We definitely did not have a Target when I was in third grade.
Yeah. In my head, Target is actually this probably 17 times the size that it actually was and sold more things than it actually sold, but because it was so glorious to have this store in our town.
Mine is more embarrassing than that, I have to say, which is that at some point my mom brought back from a work trip a Harvard Law t-shirt. And I was probably in 6th grade, 7th grade. I knew what Harvard was in the same way that what the Queen of England is, right?
Oh my God, Erin, you were oh gosh, what's her name? From Gilmore Girls.
Rory.
Take that back.
Not Rory. The blonde girl. Paris.
Take that
awesome.
back too.
No, Paris is fabulous.
So anyway, but it was a adult sized shirt, and even now I'm not exactly adult sized, and so I wore it as a sleep shirt, and I wore it forever and ever and ever and ever as a sleep shirt. And the reason it sticks, kind of in family lore, is that it remained in my bedroom until my parents, moved. And it was extremely ratty. I mean, it was over 20 years old by that point. And my mom packed it up and put it in a very handed it back to me with a Post-it note. And I think I still have the Post-it note on it that says, "I can't throw this away. You'll have to."
Fair.
And it just sort of sits there. So anyway, that's my very ratty, very soft Harvard Law t-shirt.
Mine is not dissimilar to Lauren's, but relates to TJ Maxx. And I had, again, I think it was probably 6th or 7th grade, gone to TJ Maxx and found these truly amazing, stretchy, elastic, purple and pink striped flared pants.
Wow.
And yeah, that's right. And they were the right length, which at the time when they did not sell women's jeans in a variety of lengths, and everyone had these really long, dragging on the floor jeans, and my jeans were always too short, and I always felt really dorky, felt like these were the coolest pants that a person could have, and wore them a non-infrequent amount of times, though trying to carefully time it so I didn't seem like an outfit repeater. So these pants feature in many a picture that are in my parents' photo albums from my middle school years.
I will keep this question brief because I feel like we go down 7 rabbit holes of early 90s fashion. Do you guys remember stirrup pants?
Loved them.
Yes.
Oh my God. Stirrup pants were great.
I've seen them back. Where was I where I saw them? Maybe at American Eagle, or I was with the children, and there were definitely stirrup pants were back, and I was like, people are going to feel some kind of way about this.
Yeah. And similarly, bodysuits. But there's this new item of clothing that is meant to look like a bodysuit, but isn't actually a bodysuit. It's just meant to look like you're wearing one because it has the cutouts on the side. Whoa. That was when I was I am old and I just need to give up.
I never was into bodysuits. That seemed like there was a level of logistics that I was unwilling to invest in.
Right. Yeah. It's why am I wearing a bathing suit during the day? Okay. All right. So
that's enough fun and sunshine and rainbows.
All right. So first up, we have It's a Drill, where we talk about what is going through people's minds in the cocktail circuit or the coffee circuit, depending on your beverage of choice. I I get the privilege of talking about the Department of War, and I'm going to save it because I want to have other people have the joy of being able to join in too. So I'll start off actually first with Aaron about the arrest of the Korean workers, which isn't much in the news here, but man, is it overseas. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of picked this topic as like obviously this week in particular and the week before have been difficult for any news to break through. Like there was an iPhone release, which I think most people probably like totally missed because it got overwhelmed by 17 other really awful news cycles. But among the other things that happened in the last week was there was a ICE raid at a set of factories in Georgia. They were Hyundai and LG, which are Korean companies, and they arrested over 300 workers, presumably or ostensibly for visa violations, who were, engineers and other, support staff, basically, in these factories in Georgia. As Lauren said, didn't really make a blip here, but apparently it's had essentially wall-to-wall coverage in Korea. There was eventually basically a charter flight where all of these, the 300 people who were arrested were released, flew back to Korea. It is the sort of thing that's basically, an international incident and would be getting at least coverage on like, I don't know, CNBC or Wall Street Journal in sort of normal times. But also, I think kind of just reflects this tension of, ongoing activity by ICE and the Department of Homeland Security against various immigrant communities in the United States, and some part of the Trump administration's economic or industrial policy, which is please invest here and please build your factories here. And it's like, well, what is there any consistency to this? And I think the answer is no. And I will not spend a lot of time looking further for it. But it did just really strike me that this did not seem to make much of a blip here, but is a pretty major action against an allied citizens and partner companies who have otherwise invested quite a lot in the United States.
It's like in an administration where you actually had a national security council, which I honestly don't even know if they do anymore. Like I've just sort of given up on like, do you guys even talk about stuff? In a normal one, there would be a meeting where somebody would turn to the head of the Department of Homeland Security and say, WTF, dude? And there would be yelling and maybe throwing things, and they would all commit to doing better. But I first of all, I don't think that actually happens. And second of all, I'm not even sure in this administration that they would care per se, because like the chaos, for whatever reason, is glorious to them.
Rada.
Yeah, so I watched with interest this recent event at the White House on AI skills, which was pulled together a number of organizations, both companies, but also like nonprofit and education support, focused on committing resources to training students in AI and AI related skills so that we had an AI ready workforce, which I'm totally supportive of. I love education and want to have a workforce ready for AI and many other things. But it's just an interesting juxtaposition of, couple $1 billion there when they've cut something like between $7 and $10 billion in grants. There's a current proposal to they want to shut down the Department of Education, slash its overall budget by 15%. There are thousands of grants that were terminated midstream. So all of these things go to also fund education and students at high school, college, and then graduate school levels. And so the juxtaposition of we want an AI ready workforce with the reality of funding made it seem a lot like AI theater rather than AI policy. And so it was just a interesting moment of kind of these two things happening almost simultaneously.
Oh, is AI theater like a thing that people say? Because if it is, I love it. I mean, if it's not, then you should own it, Rada.
I say it.
Oh, okay. All right. So everyone, AI theater, start using it and do the cite Rada Iyengar poem.
Okay, yeah. Lauren, let's talk about the dumbest thing that's happened in a long time.
Okay, so I'll do my take, and then everyone else should definitely win because there's so many possible ways to get to this. All right. So years ago, some friends of mine and I met this person who had signed up to be a reservist. I won't say what service, reservist intel officer. which is great. This is wonderful. I'm so happy they did this. But somebody asked them, why did you do this? And they said, to kick ass. And I just feel like our Department of Defense and Department of War, all the people who have came up with this amazing idea to rename it the Department of War, they are all that person who think that the entire reason that we have this entire massive ecosystem of the former Department of Defense was to kick ass. And it's just it's a broy type decision that has spawned a number of incredibly stupid acronyms as associated with it. Like, did you know that the Deputy Secretary of Defense is now the DSW, a shoe store? And like just all the gajillions of dollars that they're going to have to spend in order to change websites and seals and paper and like so many other things. And the final thing that really, really irks me about it is that it just fundamentally does not understand that if the United States is in a state of war, then the Department of Defense has messed up. We have done bad things. We have entirely missed the whole point of having spent a gajillion dollars every year on defense was to prevent us from being in a state of war. And that, like, you have actually done all the things wrong. Please go home. May God have mercy on your soul. Those are I can try to keep it as brief as possible, but Rada and Aaron, please jump in too, because there's so many possible angles here.
But it's like, but that is literally what they ran on. Like, establishment people have made us be in endless wars, which are bad. I actually agree with that statement. And we shall not have these wars anymore. So why now would we have an entire department dedicated to what? Like, it's the exact opposite of what they said. And then
maybe they didn't mean that. Maybe that was insincere at some level. I'm just putting that out there.
Why would that be so?
It's not consistent with anything else I've observed to date. The only other piece I will just say is the renaming also extends into the National Security Council, which Aaron noted, question mark, what do they do? But I read an article where they renamed the Defense Directorate inside the National Security Council, the War Directorate, and in a little bit of insider, like the tags for the various directorates are like a hashtag, which they say pound. So it'd be like pound Asia or pound. And this is pound war. And I don't know. Every time
how could
I
you
hear
say
it
that
now,
with
I
a straight
Google.
face? Like, how could you go to work and say it with a straight face?
So we need to include pound Asia and pound Europe and also pound war. Bring pound war.
Just unbelievable. I guess my most pedantic objection to this is that the War Department previously was just the Army, right? Mm-hmm. That's why you had, like, Teddy Roosevelt was Undersecretary of the Navy, and like some other schmo was like Undersecretary of the Army. And that's just like what the broader civilian apparatus was for kind of managing things prior to 1947. And so calling it the War Department, while it managed as like a substitute for the Defense Department, is just historically inaccurate, unhelpful, and like clearly a thing that they are very invested in. And now it's the DSW, it's the USW. USW has a whole other meaning in this world, people. Like, it's anyway. I hate it.
DASW. Your dad. It's supposed to, like, a DASD. Like, that's a thing you can say out loud. What are you now? A DASWA?
Yeah, it's bad. Sure. Like, whatever, guys. Let's go.
Time to move on to dumpster fires, of which they're, again, like, we have to basically just like draw straws every week of like, what are we possibly going to talk about here, because there's too many possible dumpster fires. But we're going to start with it's September, which, lots of people think like, oh, back to school, which we talked about last time, or fall, or pumpkins. But all of us government nerds think about the fiscal year and the end of the fiscal year. Because why not? Like, it's just a glorious thing to celebrate amidst Rosh Hashanah and fall festivals and Ren Fair and the end of the fiscal year. So, Aaron, let's chat the budget universe.
Indeed. So, there's a couple different ways to frame this, but just, normally we would have a discussion around, what is the, strategy going into September 30th, October 1st? How, are the parties kind of playing chicken with each other? Who's got the majority? Is there a plan for a continuing resolution? Because I think we've all long since given up the ghost that there would actually be an appropriations bill of any kind fleshed out by September 30th. And we'll kind of get to all of that. But there's a lot of other things kind of going on. Like, do we even do appropriations now? And so I think just to set the stage a little bit, we are currently on a full year continuing resolution because the last time this topic came up in March, congressional Republicans, despite controlling all, the House, the Senate, and the White House, could not come to terms on appropriations or felt it was politically advantageous to elide that conversation. And so they signed on to a full year continuing resolution. That hasn't happened in a while. It's not, unheard of, but it's also not great. It locks you into the previous year's funds, although they did some hinky stuff to allow for a few I don't know, changes to that. Of course, since March, we've also had Doge. We've had like the dismantling of entire government agencies, and we've also had a formal rescissions package, which I'm going to ask Lauren to explain in a little bit more detail here below. So, as we go into what in some ways is a very frequent and well understood process of appropriations and kind of end game, and will we or won't we have a shutdown before Christmas? We have that tactical discussion, but we have a much broader set of, I don't know, almost constitutional issues to address or resolve. And maybe I'll just sort of start here to you guys. Does the budget process even work anymore? Like, do we do appropriations? Do congressional Republicans want to pass appropriations bills? Like, what are we doing here?
So it's a really, really good question. And I think the big answer, the answer that we are in the moment right now is like, no, the budget and appropriations. First of all, the budget process doesn't really work anymore, where agencies are teeing up their own funding decisions to go through the White House. And then with that, the appropriations process also doesn't really work anymore. But I think a lot of folks were holding out it being the last great hope of where Congress might actually assert some authority in some way, because they do actually, they could, if they wanted to, be powerful in control and help incentivize the White House, the executive branch in some way. So it hasn't really worked for a long time. We haven't had untimed budgets in a while, but it has been a way to force debate over key issues, but in extremely, extremely dumb ways at the last minute rather than as a part of a normal process. So you will see like the subcommittees on appropriations will like work through, they will work through issues, but then it'll be as though it's entirely ignored and we just shove everything into a big omnibus and try to get it all done at the last minute, which means that you're talking about all of the issues associated with resourcing the federal government like a horse race, as opposed to debating it in terms of overarching policy trade-offs that are resident in the budget over the course of the year that they actually have to do this. Well, in theory, the year they have to do this, you really have like 2 months to do it at absolute best. So short answer, no, it doesn't really work, but it could if they wanted it to. There's not a reason for it not to. They have just chosen to not actually want to have any vehicle by which to debate trade-offs.
Yeah, and I think just the one thing I'll add is the budget process and then the sort of like reconciliation efforts afterwards were a way to force some conversations, and at least as Lauren notes, like kind of on the margin trade-offs that I don't know if I'd call it bipartisanship, but at least like there was horse trading and four corners conversations that existed in the budget process such as it was that now wholly don't need to happen. And that's probably not great.
And many of our listeners know this, but just to state it very clearly, because of how we do this now, that means that agencies have to assume, as opposed to assuming they can actually spend money that they are allocated, they have to assume they'll have no predictability, no knowledge of their actual budget, that they can't do contracts, they can't do new starts. And in many cases, agencies won't do any of their hiring until they know exactly what their budget is going to do. So it shoves a whole lot of government business into a small part of the fiscal year, as opposed to spreading it out normally over a period of time, which is what like a regular organization might do.
So as I mentioned above, one of the things that's a little bit different in this cycle is that this summer there was a rescission package that came through. And I guess it was very difficult for me to wrap my brain, around that, because a lot of the debate that was around the Doge, cuts, and agency terminations and things was sort of like, well, but there's still congressionally appropriated funds for that, so they're not actually saving any money because that money was, still dispersed, and like, what are we doing here? So one way that the administration chose to address some of that was to submit an actual rescission package. Lauren, can you just sort of walk us through first kind of what a rescission package is, and then we can talk about like how that then plays into a budget discussion?
Sure. I mean, the short version is if for whatever reason an administration has decided to make changes in how they are spending over the course of the year, whether by they've decided to eliminate an agency or eliminate a program or substantially rebalance some of those funds based on new priorities or an emergency that didn't actually happen, you can go to Congress and say, okay, we want to make these changes. You told us here's how to spend the money already. We, for whatever reason, have changed our mind. We want to go back and sort of here's our proposal of how to change that and to validate it, which is different than the Doge process, which was basically saying we're just going to stop spending some of this money in some way. And there was a lot of court cases around like whether or not the executive branch had the authority to do this, and some of that is still ongoing. And so in going back, what's interesting is by having to put their specifics together and say, we no longer want to fund these foreign aid programs, PBS, NPR, some global health challenges. Then Congress, as opposed to being able to avoid it previously, they then had to actually grapple with, oh, I'm putting my name on no longer funding part of the global AIDS program or no longer funding my local public radio station, which was a different political challenge for them, but ultimately got passed it's called like the Rescissions Act of 2025 or something like that, which is different than the pocket rescissions process that is going on right now of the administration coming to the end of the fiscal year and saying, we actually don't want to spend this money and we don't have time to spend it anyway, so we're just not going to spend it. Those are different things.
So as I think about that and the impact on the budget process, I guess on the one hand, these were appropriations and based on a budget that was submitted in the previous administration. So, okay, maybe there's some, trades that you're going to make, although I don't remember previous rescission packages quite like this. It would make me as a member of Congress, not that I would be particularly, interested in hard votes to begin with, but like, why make any hard decisions or unpopular decisions when the White House could just like unfund something later? I mean, it just strikes me that it even further complicates or sort of denudes Congress of its, appropriation or power of the purse abilities.
And then throws it, in many cases right now, into the court's lap. And the court is also like, wow, we super do not want to be in this place. Like we can try, but like there's a whole lot of litigation going on right now in this space that is it's messy for like the typical reasons, but it's also messy because it's throwing powers that belong to the executive branch and the legislative branch into the court's lap. And they're like, hey guys, maybe everyone should do their job as opposed to just like
what a novel idea.
Playing hot potato all the time.
Before we dive into the kind of horse race elements of this, Rada, can you remind us like what a government shutdown actually feels like? You planned or had to be like responsible for planning a lot of these when you and I were at the Pentagon. Lauren had a similar role, in OMB. But just what are the impacts of a government shutdown? I mean, is it a minor inconvenience or does it like suck for like a really lot of people?
I mean, I think you should start with if you are following the rules of what should happen during a shutdown, which is, I think, an important caveat, then it is an incredible administrative burden and extremely disruptive. What has to happen is basically you have to identify all the non-essential activities that aren't required to execute some critical missions. And the Department of Defense, that there is a parsing at lots of places, a lot of the missions entirely shut down, and then you send people home. Those people don't get paid until there is an appropriation, though of course they now, at least I believe, have a legal right to get paid. But then there are a whole set of activities that have to continue happening, and those people have to continue working without pay, which is also not great. And then there's a whole set of activities that the government does that enable the private sector, like contracts and contract execution, but also taking delivery of like things that you have bought, for instance, that the government can't do during a shutdown. And so it creates a host of backlogs outside the government for anyone that is engaging or relies upon government services, which can be anything from beneficiaries for various programs to companies who either buy or sell things to the government, to suppliers who contribute to those companies in that supply chain. So it's a massively disruptive event. And the longer it goes on, the greater the disruption.
So as we kind of think about that, there's two pieces I want to think about for the horse race element here, for lack of a better term. One is what the Democrats are doing, what they should be doing, what they could be doing, and then the other is what are some things that the Trump administration might do on the executive branch side that would even make it a shutdown under these conditions even different from previous experiences. So as we think about the Dems, apparently they're toying with the idea of threatening a shutdown, which I don't know if that's the most credible threat since they're never ever in that position. But you need 7 Democratic votes in the Senate, I think, to pass whatever they seem to want to do. And so the question is, what price will those 7 extract, if any? In March, they decided basically not to fight, and Schumer released the Dems to vote, as they pleased. It seems like right now maybe they're trying to get some sort of concession? Question mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unclear right now if they are all have all together met in a room and they have a strategy and these are our priorities and this is what we're trying to get done. I think they've done a little bit of this, or if they are just making noises to see what the public will tolerate, which is probably smart because typically there's a big blame game when it comes to shutdowns, and whoever is seen as responsible gets the political pushback in some way, in whatever way that shakes out. But the Democrats seem to be pushing for some of the extension of some of the Obamacare provisions, the Obamacare subsidies, to restore some of the Medicaid cuts and a few other things that they want to ensure is in that package. But they are also framing this as kind of coming back to our earlier point around does this appropriations process even matter? Why would we as Democrats give credibility and legitimacy to a budget that the Trump administration has basically said we're going to spend and do whatever we want regardless? It's less we don't want to fund government and more this is a sham and we want to call that out in some ways. That's a hard argument to make because it's a kind of a process argument in addition to a legitimacy argument. But I think what they've been doing the past few weeks is try to throw some test balloons out to see does this actually have credibility, and could we carry this argument through during a shutdown, which would be even harder as you start to see some of the impacts come through.
And I'll just note 2 things, which is one, as Lauren, as you said, a lot of this is on the political consequences / political framing of this in terms of decision. But there is also a substantive point, which is that the Congress should have the power of the purse. And in ceding that authority, there is a fundamental undermining of the core separation of powers principles here. And it feels like Democrats should be able to make that case. I know it's a process case, but it feels like we're still in a world where people want democracy mostly. And, people learned about the separation of powers maybe. And so, I think there's just an open question on how much and how loud the Democrats are willing to do that, but also where Trump adapts his approach and responses. It's a rare point of leverage that the Democrats have right now. So it seems like it's interesting to see them being thoughtful on how to use it.
Yeah, when I think about this, I struggle to figure out what's either the more responsible or the more strategic thing. I could be kind of persuaded in either direction, but I feel like both are a bit of a hash. Lauren, one of the things I think that's interesting here is that this shutdown might not be like other shutdowns. And that somehow, in particular, because this administration maybe isn't all that interested in having strong, legislative responses, or doesn't feel bound by the budget process. Russell Vought at OMB certainly thinks that he can impound funds and move things around as basically he desires. What are some of the loopholes or, I don't know, novel approaches to a shutdown that maybe should give people caution as they play chicken around some of these issues.
Yeah. So a few things to know about this is since the early 80s, the executive branch has taken shutdowns as you must strictly shut down. You can't be like, oh, I assume funding's going to come in. We should just keep going as though that's the case. It has required a process by which agencies have to go through and say, here is what we are required to do by law versus what we're not required to do by law. Some people say essential, not essential, but that is a kind of a term of art. And therefore, the things that we're not required to do by law, we are stopping. And we are, regardless, like none of those folks who are doing this work are getting paid, but some things are continue to be executed, like at TSA or national security issues, other things that are like absolutely required. And like everything else is like as soon as you hit midnight, you're done. But that is like I said, that's post 1980s. So that's one thing that the Trump administration could consider is like, we're just going to kind of ignore this and like not do a strict shutdown and do whatever we feel like. They could, in addition, they could make everything essential so that everything continues. The American people experience no impact in terms of government operations, except for the fact that the largest workforce in the country isn't getting paid, which is a huge economic impact. There are a lot of people that are on administrative leave right now, people who took a buyout earlier in the year. And there's some questions around whether or not that like administrative leave technically can't occur during a shutdown. And so therefore, would those people be fired? Would they be back paid at a later point in time? Would they be using that as a way to get rid of them? And then folks may remember earlier when they were looking at how to execute reductions in force, one of the ways that they framed how agencies should consider getting rid of folks is that they should RIF everyone who is non-essential during a government shutdown. So this may be another sort of backdoor step to say, well, none of these folks were working during shutdown. Clearly, we can get rid of them. So we're going to RIF them again. And then there's also there's a lot of weird national emergency powers that the president has. He could use some of those in order to continue to try to keep the lights on. Those are just some of the ideas, and I say those those are the ones being circulated in the news. I'm sure there's weird other ideas floating around in the rest of its head.
But Lauren, all of those require operating without payments, right? Like if there is no appropriation, everyone is doing things without getting paid.
That's right. So it's like
something to
government keeps doing stuff, but people are not getting paid at the same time, which is not great for like a whole lot of reasons. But I again want to come back to people tend to forget that the public sector workforce is actually a workforce and big part of the labor element of the economy. When 2 million people are not receiving paychecks all across the country, that has a huge downstream effect on a lot of stuff between mortgage payments and are they spending money in the local economy? Are their kids getting food? Like all of the above.
Well, and typically we also assume that, members of the military are getting paid. Like that's usually allowed or excluded. And I think that that's sort of a toss up, in some ways. As well. I mean, I think what we're sort of laying out here is that, like many things going on right now, we should not expect, either the politics of a shutdown to play out as usual, or even the execution of a potential shutdown to necessarily follow the playbook that we've seen before. So, that's just we've got, it's currently September 13th. We're recording a little early for this episode. So we've got a little more than 2 weeks to see how everyone decides to, play this out. Next topic.
Well, I think another area that we agreed we needed to talk about, but is a complex and evolving issue, is the recent assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk while he was giving a talk at Utah Valley University. So Charlie Kirk was the founder of Turning Point USA, and he was shot and killed by a sniper while speaking to students on September 10th. As we understand it right now, the suspect has been arrested. And, we've seen a range of statements, including from President Trump, which was notable for its focus on attacks on right-wing figures. But this is also, it's helpful context to see this in light of a line of recent escalating violence that's happened on both sides. So in June, there was a shooting of 2 Minnesota Democratic legislators. In May, there was a killing of 2 Israeli embassy staffers in Washington, D.C. in April, there was an arson attack on the Democratic Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's residence. December, late last year, there was a killing of the United Healthcare CEO. Of course, there were 2 assassination attempts against President Trump himself during the election. And then there had been an attack on, even, for instance, Nancy Pelosi, and that's just kind of over Nancy Pelosi's husband, sorry, in San Francisco. And so, there does seem to be a growing trend of political violence, and we thought it might be helpful to unpack that. So maybe we can start with some basics, which is, when we talk about political violence, what exactly are we defining, and how or why is it different?
So I'm happy to start here with a bit of a political science hat on, and certainly political violence is, if you would have asked me 15 or even 20 years ago, God, when did we get so old? What is it that I study? Political violence probably would have been the answer. So in academic terms, it covers a wide range of kind of subspecialties, and is distinguished, largely from criminal violence, personal violence, in some contexts is even social violence. And so the idea is that it would be, an act of violence, which would be, could be murder, could be, physical destruction of property, could be sabotage, something that has a destructive element to it, matched with some kind of political intent. That is deliberately vague, I think. It's meant to be somewhat encompassing because it could range from, a variety of different strategies or manifestations. So it might cover things like terrorism and insurgency. It might cover a violent, a social movement that becomes more violent. And it can also cover, some smaller sorts of activities, which we might get a chance to talk about. Things like Baader Meinhof Group in Germany in the 1970s, or even like Weather Underground in the United States, as well as political assassination. And so it's not just one set of activities, but a broader set of them. And I think a lot of what we're sort of trying to figure out here, and you see a lot of this in the trying to unpack, whether it's manifestos or online readings or online other activities, is like what these perpetrators actually quote unquote believe, and does it like amount to a coherent set of political beliefs. And I actually think that the jury is kind of out on that on a lot of these individuals.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think drives many of us crazy when there is what appears to be an act of political violence is that when people who don't study it, or people don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, hear political violence or see an act that appears to be such, they may automatically assume partisan when we say political violence, and say like, oh, well, if it was targeting a right-wing figure, therefore it must obviously be a left-wing figure that is countering them in some way. When you start to dig into this question that Aaron just raised around, what do they have a coherent set of beliefs? The potential range of coherency and sets of beliefs are enormous, particularly, and we'll get in this later, particularly in an online age where there's a lot of very deep rabbit hole ecosystems that people are generating such beliefs from. So you cannot automatically make any assumptions in that direction. It may be a more extreme, radicalized version of somebody of a belief that is trying to counter to a more mainstream political figure. Maybe something that frankly doesn't make a whole lot of sense to people who don't spend a lot of time in video games or online worlds. So we're trying to make sense of something that may be a culture that is very, very, very distant than mainstream, but is increasingly having influence on mainstream in some ways.
And, I think again, there are times where this looks similar to other periods in the past, and times where this feels unique. And I think some of that social media and social media rabbit hole does feel like it's a particularly of this moment place where we're seeing this. But maybe we can take a minute to put this in a little bit of historic context, in the sense of, when have we seen similar periods of political violence in the US? And then we can maybe look for a moment outside the US to try to understand what we're seeing. So, maybe I'll turn it back to you guys on that. But obviously, folks have various periods of time in mind in these senses.
I'm going to ask Aaron to help answer the question on like the historical context, but I also want to set like kind of a framing comment around why this is particularly destructive and corrosive in democracies. It is anywhere, but in democracies, the premise is you have the ability to get your political voice heard without resorting to violent actions in some way, that you have the ability to, like, that you can influence the political ecosystem without that being a requirement. And it calls into question the legitimacy of those institutions. In addition to that, you are aiming for in democratic systems not having violence be priced in. You're aiming for, like, those systems being the place by which we can work out conflicts, whether that be at the voting, at the ballot box, or in Congress, or in court, or otherwise. When it becomes priced in, then you have a whole lot of fear baked into a system, and as opposed to it being violence against a senior figures or senior political leaders or otherwise, it becomes more counter community or counter pluralism, where everyone feels as though they're at risk. So all of that makes it corrosive to the systems that we're in, but it's shown up, as Aaron will get to, in many different ways throughout our history in the US and elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there's a lot of history of violence in various forms in the US, and you could look at it just in terms of assassinations, and for the most part we have not had a lot of political assassinations really for the last 60-ish years. I mean, there's certainly been some. There's even, there's an attempt on Ronald Reagan, but the 60s, I think, are typically the period that most people think about when they think about those assassinations. It does strike me, as we were just having that earlier part of the conversation, that I don't think that, like, Lee Harvey Oswald had particularly coherent political beliefs. I mean, like, as I think I said before, like, my dad loves a good JFK conspiracy theory, and there's plenty of them, but none of them actually make you think that, like, Lee Harvey Oswald had a clear manifesto. Some other folks, in that period maybe, but the incoherence of assassins' political beliefs, like, is an entire premise of, Broadway musicals. So, there's, I think, a lot to, and maybe we don't want to get over indexed on that. That said, there's, much longer histories of violence. I mean, the post Civil War South is built on political violence against Black Americans. We then, transition even to, anti-labor and sort of, a pretty tumultuous early 20th century of political violence that was, had a lot of upheaval associated to it. And then you get to the more sort of modern era, where I think people are, more familiar with things. And so you have, as I said before, Weather Underground, other radical groups in the 60s. And a lot of this, to Lauren's point, comes from a place of, in a democracy, typically you expect to be able to have your voice heard through voting, through other institutions. And a lot of this violence is what you might call, extra systemic or extra parliamentary activity, because those voices were not being heard in some fashion, which is not to excuse the violence, it is to explain it. And I still have a very analyst hat when it comes to these sorts of things. So I'm almost never making a normative statement about whether these things are good, justified, or effective. But is to say that, the left-wing groups of the 60s and 70s certainly felt like they did not have a voice in parliament or, Congress. And you saw similar things in Europe at the same time, for example. I actually think that there's a lot to be gleaned from the 1990s. You guys may remember Jessica Stern's book, Terror in the Name of God, which is mostly focused on, or people remember for, kind of early explanations of jihadi violence and work she was doing in Pakistan and other places. But it has several chapters on U.S. domestic terrorism, White Rose movement, Eric Rudolph, a lot of the lone wolf and individually inspired anti-abortion actors. And, at least to me, impressionistically, like, that has a lot of traction in my head for trying to explain whether you want to call that now stochastic terrorism, which is that there's sort of a general condition in the political and information environment that lets people take cues for activity, no matter how coherent or incoherent their political beliefs might be. But it does strike me that it's somewhat similar to some of those activities, which of course also include, like, the Oklahoma City bombing and some other militia type movements at the time.
And so, I mean, maybe it's just helpful to think about how the current patterns compare with those kinds of past political violence. You've talked a little bit about a couple of different versions, militia versus lone wolf. but does it seem like where do you see the recent events, maybe up to and including, but not only this recent assassination of Charlie Kirk, fitting into that kind of structure?
I mean, they certainly seem to be focused around individual actors. And I think one thing you could take some heart from is that while there certainly are, organized right-wing groups, the left wing has harder time getting organized, it seems. Um, that there are not; those are not the organizations that are promulgating this violence, right? We are not seeing, SLA type groups or Red Brigade type organizations, one way or the other. These are individuals who have become radicalized and have access to tools of violence pretty readily, and so it's not particularly militia oriented, it seems. I kind of put that in caveats because there is certainly other militia activity going on there, but the political assassinations in particular seem to be done by individuals.
The addition to that, and I say this more from a feeling of vibes and a feeling of knowledge, is the in addition to the online culture that is maybe helping inspire or offer cues to lone wolves in some ways, there's also an interesting reflection of how it's interesting to see how some of that culture ends up being reflected in mainstream culture, and that some of that I think is inadvertent and some of it is purposeful. So where you may see political leaders, religious leaders, or otherwise making reference to phrases, memes, um, other kinds of iconography that are more resident in some of those like deeper, darker holes of the internet. I think some of that is like frankly them trying to be cool, and some of it is like them knowing exactly what they are doing. And you saw a little bit of that in the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination, where for at least the first half of the day, you saw a lot of the right wing being like, we need to, like, this is it. We are going after all these left wing extremists. This is time to like lock down and arrest everybody. And then they suddenly changed their mind as they figured out or maybe not from where the assassin had come from.
And I mean, I will just add to that it does seem, like there there are these social media, there are memes and online influences that are certainly driving certain sentiments and coalescing groups that would otherwise find it hard to organize. But there does seem to be just a higher general level of violence and political violence in the US as compared to other places. I can't tell how much of that is like a vibe and how much we're actually an outlier, but it does seem like there is more here. I don't know, Erin, if you have a sense on that too, or if that's just me.
The short answer is guns and mental health, and like those are the things that that are very different in the United States and elsewhere. But go ahead, Erin.
No, I mean, I was gonna say, if I was still a researcher, I would definitely be looking at how our culture of mass shootings also affects these patterns of political violence, and both are a function of the availability of weapons of one kind or another. There are other forms of political violence. Like Shinrikyo tried to poison a subway station in Tokyo. With sarin gas, relatively rare, in the political violence, scene writ large. There's bombings that used to be much more common, in a variety of different settings. But I think, the United States is a much more fundamentally violent place than most other like OECD countries, certainly. And it's much more similar to patterns of violence at the personal level and criminal level as you would see in Latin America. And so there is, some broad, I think, contours that we can draw there. And if we think about like how other countries have tried to deal with elements of political violence, there's a few different ways of doing it, but one is typically through robust, may even say aggressive, domestic intelligence activity. And for better or worse, we actually don't really have a domestic intelligence service in the United States. To the extent that we do, it's the FBI. And boy, is the FBI an interesting place to be right now. So, I would, not expect the FBI to be really policing this very closely. And it would still be very difficult to do at the individual level, right? The FBI is actually pretty good at like infiltrating groups and monitoring group behavior and activity. That's basically because like coordination problems mean you need to use cell phones and like write things down. But if you're an individual, I mean, you basically solve the coordination problem by not needing to talk to anybody. And as a result are harder to track, but also have like a much smaller footprint of kind of the destructive wake of your actions. So, those are the kinds of trade-offs you have. But I think it's hard to say that our current institutions are really set up for really tackling violence, in the way we're currently witnessing it.
Well, obviously this is a overall sobering topic and sobering set of days here, but maybe I'll try to close us out by just, these conversations immediately almost always become polarized and especially in this period of time. And you've seen that with a number of these recent shootings, but maybe we could just be interested if you guys have thoughts on what the right response would look like, or how we break out of this cycle. Like, how do we get to a better conversation that is on how we reduce political violence, as opposed to the kind of blame game that's in the cycle right now?
One of the things that I noticed unfortunately going on social media right now is this view that Democrats are supportive of or celebrating the assassination. And that appears to be largely not the case, but the circulation of it is incredibly harmful. And to answer your question, Rada, I think that one of the most simple acts we can find is all parties, literal and figurative parties, denouncing political violence while also recognizing that the other is denouncing political violence, almost as like this is a trust building measure of like, we are all mutually denouncing. I see you denouncing. I see you taking down your rhetoric in order to do this. Like, that's one extremely big and obvious step. There's many others, but I think that is one that, particularly in the dynamic we see at this moment, that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling to be quite as pragmatic or thoughtful as Lauren here, which is to say, I would like nuke social media servers, or, do you remember, Rado, when we were in Afghanistan, if there was a casualty event and they would like shut down all the NIPRNet and you couldn't do anything until they'd done family notification. I feel like there almost needs to be like, like we're in, river condition and everything, all the social media gets turned off for 72 hours, for a week, until we like burn through the other news cycles. And then people can like go back to posting pictures of their breakfast and dogs. And hopefully you skip the part where you have, escalating rhetoric against things that haven't actually occurred.
Yeah. The other thing is, like, a good example would have been what we saw post January 6th. The FBI did a pretty significant and well-organized crackdown series of arrests that got after both individuals, but also groups that were organizing in that day. So people getting behind that would have been valuable. But what we're seeing right now, obviously, so much of that has been overturned. That is the exact opposite where we need to be moving towards. Like, accountability is incredibly important in these circumstances, and having joint understanding of what that accountability should be would be also, feels so simple to say, would be valuable.
And I'll just wrap to say that I do think, we've talked about what politicians and what the public rhetoric, but I do think just this has seeped into so much of everyday lives and everyday conversations that there's a role for just regular people to have those same conversations, condemn it, and acknowledge people of different views condemning it too. And there's, I think, societal value in that sort of small act of solidarity against political violence, which I think we can all largely say that we want to be in. Okay, so with that, I think we should move to warning signs.
For another really uplifting discussion here.
I know I can't say it's been the cheeriest of weeks, but maybe I'll kick us off to say that we've seen a number of recent events in which the U.S. but also Israel have engaged in sort of what I'll call unprecedented military actions that don't fit the way we traditionally use or deploy forces. So the U.S., for instance, deployed a number of warships and troops on these counter-narcotics missions. And as part of that, or maybe not, they destroyed a drug boat and killed 11 people without really attempting to arrest anyone. in recent times, Israel also has done the first ever attack on a Gulf state, targeting Hamas negotiators in Qatar, I guess, depending on how you say it. And so, we're seeing increasingly these recent actions as people who maybe spend a lot of time thinking about what the underlying authorization for that use of force and whether the military force should or can't be used. So maybe we'll just starting back from these recent actions, like what makes them weird or different, and why do we feel like there might be historical norms being broken here?
Well, I think, at a minimum level, right? There was a lot of questions around this strike against the boat off the coast of Venezuela, which was a lethal strike, B, carried out by a U.S. Navy warship, and leads to the initial question of sort of under what authority was this done. And I fully recognize that sounds like an angels on a pinhead sort of conversation, that it's like, well, it's War Powers Act, or it's this, or you can always find an authority. What was amazing in the immediate aftermath is they were like, we'll get back to you on the authority, we're still sorting that out. What? No. That is, like, I don't know what in the world is going on at Southcom. Like, why do we, this is, like 700 lawyers' heads explode, around that. And again, it's not that, I think a lot of people are sort of rightfully skeptical. I am often somewhat skeptical around some of these, conversations. But part of the point of a process of authorization is that you go through, the understanding of, like, is it legal? Now I've just forgotten the second part of the, like, Geneva Convention. Is it legal? Is it proportional? Is it, does it follow other, internally understood rules of engagement, right? Before you even get to any questions of international law, like, does this action conform to U.S. domestic law? And even more broadly, does U.S. domestic law constrain the executive in any of these settings? And I think that that's kind of the conversation that was kicked off for me about the Venezuela strike in particular.
The concerns that I had were similar to Aaron's, but in two different ways. One of which, it did not appear as though the administration actually felt any compulsion to ahead of time know what authority it was. Like, it didn't seem like they cared. It did not seem as though like this was something that mattered to them in terms of figuring out what authority. There's always a possible one they could have come up with. It would have been stretched to hell, but they absolutely could have if they'd wanted to come up with a few rationalizations. The second piece is, how on earth did that get through the DoD Southcom orders process such that they felt it was an okay strike to take? That is not something that ever should have been possible to do if there had not been some sort of legal justification. And none of that was alleviated by the War Powers report that went to Congress a few days later, where there was a lot of things that they could have done in order to name the organization, in order to better explain why they thought it was a legitimate target, to better explain the authority by which they use. None of they didn't do any of that. And to me, like, that has a massive alarm bells to me of, like, they are happy to use force because they feel like it. And that our military chain of command is apparently, at least so far as we can tell, okay with that. And that is enormously stressful to me in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, first, I'll just note a thought that went through my head was, what are they calling the SecDef orders book now? But that's for an earlier version of this, the war one?
The swab.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
But I think more generally, I think there's the piece of this that is the basic respect for the rule of law and making sure that it fits with it. But there's also just, like, I don't know, do we generally bomb, like, drug smugglers in the middle of, it's a particularly acute use of military force in a way that I don't know if I've seen. And that, I think, in my mind, made it particularly different. Like, it wasn't a strike against a terrorist that we often do without the effort to justify it. It's a very different use of force itself.
Now, I guess I'll play devil's advocate there and basically say, is it? I mean, I do think that there's like a pattern of justification, at least outside the formal processes, right? If you're just looking at the sort of semi-public and political discussion after the fact, that this does not look that different from a signature strike that might have occurred in Yemen, some years ago. The difference, such as it is, being that there was an authorization of use of military force, which was occasionally stretched quite far from its original intent as well. And that was, gave this, penumbra of legal authority, for those kinds of actions. And maybe a greater political acceptance or agreement that those kinds of actors were in fact threats to the United States, both its interests and its individual citizens. So I mean, I could kind of see where if you thought that that this was pattern of behavior was okay, then you get to some place on a potential drug boat. Although I don't know what evidence we have that it's a drug boat exactly. I can see some of that like public justification line, but Lauren's point to my mind still very much stands. None of that occurs on paper and should have given somebody at Southcom a lot more pause. And I agree that it's pretty troubling that didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like you're right, Aaron, that at the most superficial level, this could look like something that was a typical signature strike. But in the absence of like we are not at war with, we don't have any sort of existing conflict with the organization that they struck. Just because they call them a narco terrorist out loud does not actually mean that they are a legitimate target under any of the AUMFs that we have. And as a result, they are civilians. And that is a third thing that should be considered concerning to all of us, is that U.S. military does not strike civilians. That is both a legal but also an extreme moral principle that is part of their overall policy. And stretching this to, even if you designate them a foreign terrorist organization under the State Department process, like that does not actually confer over into a legitimate military target. It's a very separate legal authority. And that is a line that is crossed that I feel both deeply uncomfortable with on a personal level, but also wonder very much what conversations are going on amongst the military lawyers internally of like, how did this actually get through? And what is it that we are going to be able to do in the future in order to prevent such? Or have they just given up?
Well, and I also think that there's an incredible political irony here, and it goes back to this conversation we had about the War Department as well, which is that, like, to the extent that some number of people in this administration, really were opposed to the quote unquote forever wars and really wanted to kind of pull back from that level of intervention. The most forever war to ever forever war is the drug war, right? I mean, whether you're reading Tom Clancy books, watching Tom Clancy movies, or just like reading Rand reports about Colombia from the 90s and early 2000s, like there is no bottomless pit more bottomless than using military force against drug dealers. And if that's in fact what this was. I spent a good part of the earliest part of my career looking at counter FARC and kind of how FARC took over the drug trade in Colombia. Wow. Like we actually have been to that part of the movie before. It doesn't end well. There's a reason why we treat that as a law enforcement matter and usually let the Coast Guard do it and don't have, U.S. warships, embroiled in interdiction and essentially signature strikes against potential drug boats. It's nuts to me that this is the hill that some of these folks seem to want to die on.
At the top, I mentioned this Israeli strike into Qatar, which on its face feels a little different, but maybe just taking a minute to unpack that one. It was a strike by Israel into Qatar, ostensibly to kill Hamas leaders, but it was done both in a assertive way, I'll call it, and at a strange time during negotiations. So can we just take a minute to talk about why that's different? And then I want to tie these two things together.
This seems to me to have been, some sort of opportunistic strike. They have been frustrated with Hamas leadership. They asserted that they're, kind of the planners of the October 7th attack were, kind of in this cell. I think that's pretty highly disputed. And Qatar has, been played host both to negotiations and as sort of like an office for Hamas leadership for several years. at the behest of, or not behest, but like at the, encouragement of the United States and the, tacit approval of the Israelis, right? So it's not like this was, I mean, in much the same way they did for the Taliban. So it's not the case that this was like,
Oh, they're
Yasser
hiding
Arafat and the
there.
PLO in Tunis or something, right? Like this was kind of the designated place that you wanted the political leadership to be, so that you could have formal discussions with some form of that political leadership. And so, I mean, this is, even just in terms of the Middle East politics, like pretty screwed up. And then you have the question of like, it sounds as though the U.S. was notified as the strike was happening, as a, not seeking permission, and there's a huge U.S. airbase there, so there's just a lot of maybe not illegal behavior on the Israeli part, but bizarre diplomatic behavior on Israel's part, that really complicates a variety of their relationships in the region.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd note there is like that it's also striking a capital, which I know sounds kind of weird, but like, why is that a big deal? But like, it is, and all the reasons that Aaron just stated, like the fact that it was striking the capital, it with a country that Israel has at least like modestly okay relations with, is crazy. Like, it's basically I'm assuming a relationship is not going to be actually work anymore, and it didn't get the result that they were seeking. So they did all of this and didn't actually get the goods.
And so let me just tie these two things together. Maybe we can kind of close out by discussing this out, which is, it feels to me like a little bit as we talk about domestic norm setting and political violence context, there has been for a while a sort of set of international norms and international approaches, both based on domestic laws in country, but also on just kind of an understanding of how militaries, especially kind of in the Western militaries, were going to operate. And these seem like different actions in terms of intent and activity, but very much counter to the broader norms that we've come to expect and understand in uses of military force. So I guess my question is really, is it a warning sign? Like, are we moving away from those norms? If so, should we worry about that? Or are these just kind of one-off incidents? And how do we think about both the risks and what to look for in that context?
I think that my reaction to both at a superficial, but also at a to answer your question level, was both of these felt performative and not necessarily caring about impact, and felt as though that they were happy to not actually have a good explanation for them. That model of use of force decision making is concerning from a precedent level, norm setting, and also a how your military chain of command reacts to it. All of those things are warning signs to me. I don't know that they're becoming a we're always going to see this, but the fact that both of these happened recently and that it's not entirely surprising to me that both of them happened recently is something that I would want to pay attention to in terms of continued patterns of behavior.
And I guess I would say, I think that Netanyahu and Trump are both personalist politicians at this point. Whether they're personalist authoritarians, is they're certainly on some of those tracks to be sure. Um, and one element of that is their belief that they are, kind of free to use force as they see fit. And whether in the U.S. that has some other, historical, Hamiltonian and other kind of, references to it. Israel is a little bit different, obviously, in terms of their institutional structure. But I think both of these leaders feel as though they have, been put in these positions to protect their countries, and therefore they are entitled to use force against whatever threats they designate. And that's not how democracies typically work. Although certainly we can see some other examples of it. So for me, it's more of a symptom than itself the problem. With the exception, as we were discussing before, of the Pentagon and Southcom behavior in this, I find really distressing. So it's those institutions, whatever those norms are not holding, and in the absence of formal restrictions, where I think there'll be some continued use of force questions. To say nothing of the fact that, like, are these good strategic behaviors, right? Is this going to get, advance actual national interest in these regions? Do these individuals have the benefit of all of the, best intelligence and the kinds of debates you would like to see in a national security council around some of these things, versus, again, that personalist approach to things, which is, I want to do it. I think it's bad. Let's go. And we're seeing the limits of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I will, of course, worry about the institutional erosion and just global implications, like who else is going to think that they can decide to use violence whenever they feel like it. And that's not great, especially in places like South China Seas. But I do think Lauren made a point before that it's worth repeating, which is also there just seems to be a growing blitheness towards what are civilians and where military forces and military actions are used against them. Even if they're criminal civilians, they are civilians. And so that also feels like a concerning trend and at least something to watch, if not continue to fret about. With that, maybe we'll turn to the Gong Show.
So my suggestion for the Gong Show this week was a book that Lauren and I have just finished, but Rada hasn't. So Rada can chime in to say whether she maybe finds this appealing. But R.F. Kuang has a new book out this last couple of weeks. Lauren and I must have been quick to the jump to get it from libraries or to download it. It's called Katabasis, and it is a dark academia satire where the main characters go through various levels of hell, and I don't know, discuss physics. What else do they do, Lauren? Like what had you read previous R.F. Kuang books? Did it sort of
Yes.
measure up to your expectations?
So I love Babel or however we say that. I really, really, really enjoyed it. I've read it a few times. I feel like the last third kind of lets me down, but like the overall premise of the book, I just really enjoy. And overall enjoy Dark Academia. I think Rada has also read A Deadly Education. I think it's a wonderful series and really, really enjoy it. This book, so I often feel as though this author is trying to write multiple books at one time. In addition, we should note that she is, if not if she hasn't finished, then she is finishing a PhD. Which to me, it just speaks to somebody who is like deeply stressed and a little bit in over their head and maybe needs a little bit of therapy, which all of us do. This is not a judgment, but it seems as though in reading the book, like, are you working out like a whole lot of things in the books that you write? And therefore, like maybe you should try to work those out in other forums too, in addition to this place. So I enjoyed the exploration of hell, like, and all the allusions to all of the other, both literary, and I was about to say historical, doesn't quite make sense, literary references to hell. Those are wonderful and really interesting and fun. I enjoy also how they explain their use of magic in this world, which is like, if you have ever taken logic and sort of logic classes, is really interesting to see. I did not enjoy the characters at all.
At all?
No. I loved, there was a section where the two characters, Alice and Peter, are having to work together on a problem. And I loved that part because it's like, okay, you get to see their relationship and as people. The rest of it is just them having like shitty times in shitty ways. And like, not in a, I want to resonate with this, not in a, I want to help you, but just in a, why are you still here? This really sucks. So,
well, like I also did not like the characters, and that's partially because I like massively over-identify with Alice, and that's why I go to therapy, because it's like, well, here's your, high-strung, PhD student with a photographic memory and, who, can't like forget anything. It's like, yeah, I don't need to read about that in fiction, folks. Like, that's like everyday life here. So, but also, it was very difficult to tell, like, are we from an, reader perspective, we're supposed to sympathize with Alice a little bit, but she's also like clearly like really taking it out on Alice, right? And sort of the, she's like the, perfectly attractive, but not too attractive. She wants to have the affection of a mentor, but not all of the affection of the mentor. Like, I mean, on the one hand, totally resonates. We've all been like in that situation, but it's, does R.F. Kuang thinks that like she gets her comeuppance, or was there a lesson learned? It's a very, I think the characterization is what makes it tricky, because the individual scenes and like the descriptions and like the sort of like petty, that hell is just like submitting your dissertation, does resonate. I mean, it's all academia in hell. But there is just something, because I too loved Babel, and I was like, oh, I must like R.F. Kuang books. And it's like, no, dummy, you like books about insurgencies.
Yeah.
And so if you take that element away, I am like a little bit less invested in the specific dark academia trope here. So Rada, based on all that, do you think you want to read it?
Probably just going to stick with my cozy mysteries.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fine.
That's a good idea. Well, I think that's a wrap on this episode.
Yeah.
I believe we have all had the dumpster fires, the warning signs, and the miserable "it's a drill" conversations that we can possibly absorb, while also having a delightful conversation on 90s fashion.
Wonderful. We'll see you guys next time.